I'd like to welcome everybody to our discussion this morning. We're going to start out with a discussion of leadership with two of my close friends and master leaders and teachers of leaders. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll start talking. We'll spend about 20 or 25 minutes talking about leadership. And so let me start out with Mr. Utley, Mr. Jeremy Utley. So Jeremy has an interesting background. Even as a young man, he was in leadership positions, including he actually ran at Chick-fil-A early on in his life, which I think he laughs, but that's a good experience to actually have a bunch of people and have production goals and all that sort of stuff. Then he was a management consultant at a major consulting firm. I think we'll keep their name out of this for this purposes. But I think most critically for this, Jeremy, along with Perry Claiborne, we'll get to in a second, have been leading the efforts at the D School, which you learned about before. In particular, some of the stuff I'm interested in is they lead large groups and try to teach them how to become leaders when it comes to innovation. And you'll hear more about that. And so that's Jeremy. I could go on, but I don't want to take too much time. And then our buddy Perry Claiborne, who we've been working with for years, especially these guys work together a lot on leadership issues. And Perry, in addition to having taught various kinds of creativity classes at Stanford for over 15 years, Perry's been involved in various companies. He was the founding CEO of a company called Atlas, which designed and then helped spread the first modern snowshoe. Then he was a senior executive at Patagonia. And most recently, he was CEO of a messenger bag company called Timbuktu. So they're both guys who I would describe as are in between two parts of leadership. One, teaching it, two, studying it, and then also practicing it. So I think that's enough of an introduction. Why don't we did a little preparation for this. Maybe we should start out and talk about teaching leadership, since you guys are really into teaching leadership lately. Sure. And I think a lot of folks who are watching and listening to this will be interested in this. Why don't you kind of give us your perspective on teaching leadership?
Sure.
Great.
Well, thanks for having us, Bob.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Always a delight.
So much of what we want to talk about today comes from some of our experience, specifically teaching folks leadership in a class called D-Leadership, which is a class at the design school that's designed to actually send graduate students into organizations to lead design teams. And so a lot of our recent observations have come from watching folks in various cultural contexts with various industry and functional challenges try to advance ambiguous problem solving and creative problem solving inside of organizations. So much of what we're going to talk about today comes from that experience.
Great.
And the first thing that we wanted to show is a few cultural attributes that we believe are critical to fostering a new way of working. And so these are, as a leader, you've got to be focused on culture first and developing the kind of environment where people can thrive and do the kind of work that you want them to do. And so we wanted to acknowledge right away from the outset that depending on the culture, geographically or organizationally, you'll have to adapt your style in order to be effective. We've had experience in Latin America, in South America, in Asia, in Africa, and all of the things we talk about have to be amplified or diminished and tweaked to achieve the leader's desired ends. So we want to acknowledge right from the outset that you've got to be willing to adapt and flex your style a little bit.
Can you give us a quick example of when you've had to adjust your style in response to the culture?
I feel like you're setting me up here. So we had an experience actually together working in the Asian context. One thing that we identified quickly, a lot of the work that we do requires full participation and contribution from everybody in the room. And in some cultures, like the culture that we were working in, we noticed that there are hierarchy issues, and there's specifically folks feel a sense of deference to authority. That when there's a person with a higher rank or where there's someone's boss in the room, people shut down. And we acknowledged that early on as a real challenge to the work that we wanted to do, because we wanted every single person in this session to work and contribute their best ideas. And so we see leadership as a design challenge, actually. And so after the first day, the three of us got together and said, okay, what are we going to do to affect people's behavior such that we actually can achieve the outcomes we want to achieve? And we learned that as we reflected on these particular cultural challenges, we learned that people needed to feel confident that they had time to to articulate a statement that they actually believed in. And our style in this workshop was just throw people in and then say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And we realized in the Asian culture, that put people on the spot, and nobody likes being on the spot in front of their boss. And so what we did the second day is we said, all right, we need to change. And rather than asking people, what do you think? And you have to respond immediately in front of the camera, we said, okay, take 2 minutes, everybody write down a couple of things you think. And so we honored the fact that people needed to feel a little bit more equipped and prepared to answer a question. And then what we did to make sure that everybody had a voice and felt included, we actually went around and rather than asking people at random, we said, now we're all going to share the thing that we wrote down. And so we had every single person in the room share. And what that did over time is it gave the impression that everybody's ideas are valid, that no idea was necessarily bad, and that no one needed to be afraid of what someone else in the room thought. But a subtle tweak to how we were managing the room.
I don't know we were going there, but that's an interesting example. The other part about that is we had a member of our team who was from Japan who helped a lot, Yusuke. And Yusuke said the goal was to make it so that it was embarrassing not to participate rather than to participate. And I thought that was pretty cool.
And changing a default.
Changing the social pressure.
That's great.
So, so tell us more about how you teach leadership. That was sort of a side trip, but an interesting one.
So, I want to talk for a moment about the D School and the differences between design and design thinking. So at the D School, we teach a process called design thinking, and that's the tenet of really how we were going to get in this D leadership class, what techniques and processes we're using and training the leaders on. And I think the key thing to think about is the difference. You're welcome to look at the design school, D School website at Stanford and read more about design thinking. But the difference is, it's subtle, but in design, it's very much usually individual effort, and the outputs are more about the particular product and making something and getting it done. Design thinking is more about a collaborative effort, a consistent and repeatable process around innovation, and that's really where we get into, is we get into putting our students into circumstances where they need to affect change, and they actually need to drive innovation in the organization. With that, I want to talk about the class itself. We've got this image you're seeing is how we actually use our process on ourselves. So Bob will recognize these types of post-it note schedules and this type of thing. Believe it or not, this is the way we start, and we work for quite a bit, and even till the moments before the class, as you're used to, Bob, we're changing things on the fly. But the key thing, if you can see the colors there, the class itself, there's an interesting construct. We take some of the best students that have been trained in this process called design thinking. When they've gone through another class and been recommended by other professors at the D School, we interview them and recruit them into D leadership, and they work in duos for the term, and they head off into companies. So we've lined up, I think, 12 companies or so this past year. So 24 students head off in pairs into these companies, each company having a particular challenge they're facing. So one of them of note this last year was Victoria's Secret that wanted to change their in-store experience. So 2 students went into Victoria's Secret, which is a massive undergarments company that's global, and they would try to drive the innovation efforts around a certain challenge they had. I think it was around in-store merchandising of bras, if I recall. So it was a really challenging effort to get in there and actually affect some change in the company. So D leaders head off, and you can see the column of red. They head off for part of the week they're in the companies, part of the week with us training. And then if you see the column to the extreme right, there's also feedback loops. So we have the company giving direct feedback, and we deal with that to actually teach the content in the class.
So the thing that we've learned in teaching this class that's a big shift for students, graduate students at Stanford are highly proficient. They are meticulous, perfectionists, and so they're always thinking about how do they do the project. And a big shift in D leadership that what you don't see, that's the closest thing that we get to a syllabus. That's that picture right there. It's funny when students ask for the syllabus, we send them a photo of a whiteboard with a bunch of Post-its on it and say, this is subject to change. In fact, we know it will change. But the thing that we see over time is that students really have to shift gears from thinking that they are responsible for the project to seeing that their team is responsible for the project. And it's a fundamental shift. And actually at the end, that I think the crop missed the the last presentation, the partners themselves have to make. So rather than the students who are leading Victoria's Secret making the presentation, Victoria's Secret team has to make the presentation.
Well,
and the students' grade is a function of how the team performs.
So this is one thing I really like about this approach to leadership, which is one that's actually been written a lot about other places, but the way you guys are defining leadership is, it's not exactly what I do, it's the impact I have on others.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I think that's really an important point for anybody who's thinking about what leadership is,
Right.
Because you're not having a success or an impact unless other people's behavior are changing.
Right.
And so in the classroom, one of my favorite part is the students are fairly horrified to discover that their grade isn't based on what they do, it's based on what the people they are mentoring or leading do.
Which requires a shift, right? It requires you to actually say, rather than the output of the project being my product is the capabilities and the behaviors of the people who are on the team, and shifting your focus from the end result to the team.
But one of the reasons I think that it's so interesting for anybody who's interested in becoming a leader is it's a change in focus on others from oneself. And certainly you have to focus on yourself to manage yourself so you can influence them and they don't think you're crazy and all that kind of stuff. But the whole thing is it depends on the impact on others, and no matter how fantastic essentially your performance looks in the mirror, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
It's what they do.
Right. And we judge a leader's quality and mettle by how well they create other leaders. And so in this class in particular, our goal is for leaders to create leaders inside of organizations. And then the one thing, your job, if you think about what are you doing, what are you making, whereas if you're responsible for the project itself, you're thinking about the product or service, whatever you're delivering. But if, as the leader, what you're doing and what your product is, besides the people, is you're cultivating conditions for the team to succeed. And so your job as a leader is actually to design the conditions for your team to thrive, and to be acutely aware of what are the expectations, what's the tone, what's the culture that is enabling my team to perform and to do the job that they need to be doing. And so you're thinking about the people and then the environment that you create around them to enable them to succeed.
And the graph we draw constantly for the students is a graph that essentially says that your participation in the project itself, by the end, as demonstrated by the final presentation in this class being given by the company, not by the students, are actually not allowed to say anything. They're just allowed to watch their team actually present the project. Is your role in the project decreases, and you should see the team's engagement increase. So you should be creating another leader, in fact, or other leaders within that group, and giving up those process pieces, design thinking, whatever the process is we've actually put into the company, and we want to talk about that. There should be less and less of an active role by the leader.
So this is a great example. I mean, one thing I love about this class is it isn't just this play exercise like we usually do. It really is when you look at great ideas and movements that have spread throughout industry. Just over the weekend, I spent a lot of time exchanging email with a guy named Joe McCann. Joe led an effort that actually helped save 100,000 lives in U.S. hospitals. I mean, to get rid of these preventable medical errors. And he had a 10-person team, so it's sort of just like yours, little 10-person team. And so we said, very quickly, we learned our definition of success was when we left and they didn't need us anymore, we had succeeded.
Right.
And that's exactly the same model you use. So I just love that sort of definition, and it's kind of a multiplication type impact too.
Well, a lot of students come into the class thinking it's going to teach me how to be a consultant, because that's kind of the framework they have.
As a former consultant,
right?
You know
Yeah, as a recovering consultant, right? They think it's going to teach me how to be a consultant, and one thing that we say is no. It's a fundamentally different thing, because you win when they stop calling you. Right? And it's a different model for people to get in their heads, because as a high performer, you like to be needed.
Right.
But as a leader, your end goal is, my team doesn't need me. That's when you know you've done a great job, when they stop calling.
That's fabulous.
Yeah.
So we can skip. So we've covered this. Your goal is work yourself out of a job.
The one thing that we should talk about here is, what do you do in the interim? Right? If the end goal is get your team to stop calling, if your end goal is to have your team fully functioning and operating with the capabilities and behaviors that you want them to, how do you get them there? And that, when we talk about leadership in the interim, it's really about striking the balance between creating conditions and being a facilitator of process and helping the team see the right milestones and deliverables they need in the midterm. The other thing is actually being an active contributor and being almost, the way we call it, is the most enthusiastic contributor. And actually striking that balance between getting other people excited about the work, but then modeling the behavior by doing it really well yourself. And a lot of students really, it requires very unique and complementary skill sets to be able to both do the work that you're asking people to do and then also give them the space to do it themselves. And that's really, it's kind of a tightrope walk. And that's what we do with a lot of the classes, help students know how to read your team and know what modality is required of you as a leader. Is it better to worry about or focus on the environment, or is it better to focus on how can I be modeling the right behavior and learning when to do what?
So then the one slide that just has these acronyms, DT and CT, so design thinking and critical thinking. This is something you've actually taught us to be very aware of, Bob, is in the organizations, critical thinking and problem solving is what these organizations are doing all the time. So we've talked about Victoria's Secret. They are excellent at making clothes, delivering clothes, getting them on the shelf, having the shelf look beautiful. So all of a sudden this team comes in and says, well, we want to figure out how to communicate better with our customers. We want to change that store experience. We want to be more relevant to a new consumer. That's a completely different way of working. The innovation, the design thinking piece, and the critical thinking piece. And there's a plus sign in the middle. And that's the goal. It looks like a simple math equation, but it's actually an explosion when you put the two together most of the time. And that's the challenge we put the D leaders right in the middle of, is the company desperately wants this innovation. And I love some of the questions that have been given to us in the past. But the idea is that piece of it's, I think, the amazing piece, right, is putting those two together. And Charles O'Reilly, one of your associates, talks a lot about this, is it's a constant state of conflict between those two things is the thing we've kind of come to realize. It's not ever a steady state. It never magically fits together. There's no perfect culture that actually these things fit together in. It's really how you manage as a leader to be in the middle of that and deal with a constant sort of conflict. And there are trade-offs all the time.
Right.
Between
and one thing that Charles O'Reilly's research has shown, which is fascinating for organizations who are really trying to do disruptive work to think about, is that the capabilities that are required to discover new opportunities are actually, in some ways, not just different from, but actually opposed to the capabilities that are required to profit from those opportunities. And so as a leader, how do you cultivate the capabilities of discovery while not shutting down the capability of exploitation?
Well, this is sort of interesting because this is this balancing act that what Charles was talking about is essentially, if you want to have a repeatable process that goes over and over again, you don't want to have a lot of conflict, maybe a little bit of argument about how to make the process a little bit better sometimes, and you go back to doing it perfectly, versus waiting in the mess where you don't know what the hell's going on at all, and your job is to sort of clean it up. And it is interesting just from watching you guys deal with creative organizations trying to get their mind around this.
Right.
It really is a different way of thinking because they have to accept that it's messy, it's uncertain, and they're not going to be right. And in fact, one thing, and we've talked about this before with Pixar, I love the Pixar motto. Perry and I were just talking about this, that their perspective is that if you're doing something that's okay, then you're screwing up. Because if you're going to do something new, it has to really, really suck, because that's a sign you're doing something right. So they go from suck to non-suck, but mediocrity to them is the enemy. Right. And if you were teaching people to do a routine task, if they were doing a pretty good but not a great job, you'd be pretty happy because you could say, oh, well, they could learn how to fly the airplane or do the routine surgical procedure, but you guys are teaching something much more out there. So it's a different sort of thing, different kind of leadership.
The thing that makes me think of is that, back to this issue of ambidexterity, as O'Reilly puts it, that a leader doesn't exist in a vacuum. You are not an individual autonomous agent. You actually, these kinds of messy topics, as you said, they force alignment issues among leadership teams and among people who are responsible for leading in organizations. And the question becomes, is there a place to fight? I think you talk about having a safe place to fight and argue, right? Is there, I know in Charles's paper he mentions having a room that's soundproof.
Yeah.
So that senior leadership teams can
So they can
duke
scream
it
at each
out,
other.
right? But that's what it requires. It's not clean. If you're looking for clean and operationalizing and efficiency, that's a variance reducing process. If you're looking for new and disruptive, it's inherently messy. It inherently requires trade-offs, and you have to have a team that's aligned that that's worth it, and then willing to endure the fight to get to the right answer.
Okay, so I like where we're going, because let's take about 5 minutes more and think, especially for a leader who is in charge of creative work. I don't want to say charge, want to create conditions where creative work happens. Mm-hmm. What are some of the other bits of advice you've got? You've already.
I think one thing in the class we kind of breezed over, which is something I think our advice. I think one of the things that you've cued into with this class is the structure of sending students into an organization. Okay, is interesting. We send students oftentimes into an organization that they have no interest or very little interest in working in. So think about that as a construct. Diego, one of our associates, Diego Rodriguez, talks a lot about where's your place to fail, right? So we set up this construct where this is a four-wheel company. They really want results.
Better room service.
This student, I forget her team, Kelly and who were in, David, were in this company, Victoria's Secret. Neither one of them won a job in women's apparel. It's not of interest. But this company very much wanted a certain project done. They engaged and they did it. But because they were in a new place, a place with sort of the risk and the load of their career having to move up and all this stuff have to happen, they were just in a class, I believe they took a lot more personal risk. And they tried on new styles they wouldn't have tried before, and they tried new techniques. And success and failure, they had their ups and downs. They had points when Victoria's Secret called us up and said, I'm not sure we want to continue. They had points where Victoria said, this is the best thing that ever happened. But that's part of the magic, I think, is if you're a leader, one of the things we see is very often you sort of take the most important project at work, the best team at work, and you say, okay, I'm going to try this new effort, I'm going to try on this new style, or I want to push to do this. My advice is find something maybe that's not the fully loaded, high-risk thing to do.
Well, and what that reminds me of, and the subtlety there that's embedded in what you're saying, Perry, is that we believe leadership is a craft.
Right.
And it's something that can actually be honed over time through experimentation. Right. And so rather than thinking about your style as this fixed thing, think about your projects and your teams as vehicles for your own experimentation, and actually learn to modulate your style. And learn what works in what situation.
So I like that, because I think that brings together, we've worked together a fair amount. I think I actually got an interesting email from a professor who's having trouble teaching one of my books to obnoxious MBAs in Hong Kong. True story, just over the weekend. He said, you said leadership is a craft and you can't do it unless you practice it a lot. What does it have to do with evidence-based management? And my reaction was, well, do you want a surgeon who knows all the latest, has read about and studied all the latest surgical techniques? Or do you want a surgeon who's done a lot of operations? Which ones do you want? Right. Well, the answer is both.
Yeah.
And so this idea of it being an evidence-based craft where people can actually learn, I think is kind of the nirvana. But I mean, I don't want a surgeon who's read about it really, really a lot of times and has read all the studies and has never done the operation. But I don't want the one who's done a lot of operations, maybe wrong his entire or her entire life.
The one thing that I would say though, if you treat every team and every project as if it's life and death and a surgical operation, I think it's your attitude is it's too precious.
Yeah, so I think that's what's wrong with kind of routine work and high risk work.
Yeah.
So I think that goes back for creative work. You want to create a situation where it's okay to fail. And one thing I would say that happens with a lot of companies, even though they don't even talk this way, is they've got these big R&D budgets, and they can spend really a lot of money failing. And it's a good idea to spend a lot of money failing. You look at pharmaceutical companies, most of what they do fails and they know it. And that's just part of the process of developing new compounds. So, and you can do things like test in wind tunnels, and there's other places you can test that failure is okay. It isn't just a matter, it doesn't have to be cheap, because sometimes most of the venture capital firms in the Silicon Valley, most of the deals that they invest in fail, and they know it. But it's to get those crumbs that are usual hits. So the question is, what's the upsides part of it too?
There's also pieces, I think, this whole thing of critical thinking and design process. And I think the innovation process is messy, and our leaders get into these kind of the honeymoon period, right? They go in and it's fun to brainstorm and it's fun to do these prototypes, but we surprise them, I don't know, a couple weeks in and ask their sponsors, how much does the senior management know about what's going on in the project? And usually the ones having the most fun, the senior management knows nothing, and they're destined to failure when they try to bring it back, or they've engaged them too much, and they're having a lot of trouble getting started. We can't seem to get a good meeting under our belt. We can't seem to get moving. Everybody wants to know the details before we start. Everybody wants to know when we're going to deliver. We had this one company, a New Zealand company, Comvita, wanted to, when can we have the finished store design?
Right.
Like week one. They were going to do a new store design for the U.S., and they wanted the design. They couldn't relax without, a senior manager was like, I need something so I can relax. Then you guys can have fun.
Right.
They wanted it backwards from the innovation process. That's the challenge.
But that's a pretty good leadership lesson, I would say, even for more routine work, which is that you want to have enough support and cover for the top, but you don't want them in your face constantly. Right. So a lot of what a leader's job is to figure out how to create cover for his or her team. And legitimacy.
And get out of their way.
And they get out of their way. But not having senior management overly interested in it. And I mean, over the years, even back in the way old days in Hewlett-Packard, I remember one of my students studied successful versus unsuccessful efforts at Hewlett-Packard. And the least successful ones usually were the ones that the senior executives were most interested in because they were annoying the development team too much. So what the trick at Hewlett-Packard at one point was, well, you show them the bright, shiny things that distract the senior executives, but you do the real work in the back because they'll mess it up. Yeah. And so sometimes that's part of it. So I think that it's probably just about time to wrap up. Any sort of closing comments on leadership? Any closing advice?
I think the one thing I'd say is in D-Leadership, we use the alumni quite a bit. So the other thing we've learned is, where's your mentor? And we do it very structured. We bring them in and we actually oftentimes have this current group of D leaders are prepared for whatever they're prepared for next with their partners, right? So they're about ready to go in and lead a brainstorm session or lead some kind of creative session to do something. We'll call it charretting. They actually, with alumni, will run through the first 5 or 10 minutes of their meetings. And a lot of times they get from the alumni the ability to manage expectations and get a sense of a little bit more perspective as to what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the things you said, good leaders. I think good leaders is just a function of mileage. I think I think that's one thing I know from my career in business is you put so much weight into what you're doing, you work months and months and months on it, rather than trying to get more cycles and more projects and more opportunities to lead under your belt. I think that would be the strong advice I'd give that we give in leadership is a very tightly constructed 7 weeks, you saw it, where they get an amazing deep dive into this stuff, their hands very dirty, and they come out of it, I think, much, much better. And you see they got a few other opportunities in there to lead smaller projects.
I guess the closing piece of advice I would have is that trying to change culture is a fool's errand, and the goal isn't what we found. The goal is not to change the culture, but to find the elements of the culture that support the kinds of things you want to do, and to go where there's momentum there. So you've seen the design process,
right.
And we're all familiar with empathizing and rapid prototyping. It doesn't mean you shouldn't force feed it kind of foie gras style, right? That's not the way to do it. What you should say is, does the organization care about customers? Then that's a great place to start and talk about customer delight, right? Is the organization, maybe we've seen other organizations that aren't really concerned with customers, but they love product. And so we say, start with prototyping.
Go where the energy is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can kind of use the judo move, right? It's if you're starting with prototyping, then you say, we need to test this with customers really quickly. And to a product-driven company, then that makes sense. But if you lead with, we got to empathize, they go, what are you talking about? And so it's not about changing or fighting the culture so much as finding the elements of the culture that are aligned already, and then leaning into those elements to accomplish your objectives.
So I just want to make one more comment, and then I think we can switch gears. But it is sort of interesting when I hear Perry talk and I hear the description, and I think this is important for all of us who are involved in the unstable organizations and lives that so many of us have. One of the lessons that comes from what you've done, and I think of my buddy Tom Byers in our entrepreneurship program here at Stanford too, is that if there's a bunch of people who you've got are mentors, and you've mentored a bunch of people, and you all are connected to one another, so this is part of the effect of your D-leadership model, and you're all connected to one another, it actually doesn't matter that much what happens with the company or the job you're working in right now. When things shift, you've always got a group of people who are going to take care of you, and you're going to take care of them, and you're going to be okay no matter what the economy looks like or no matter what the politics are in your organization, if you're staying within a large organization. So to me, that's another implication. Some of it's power in politics, but some of it is also besides the fact that that's what leadership is, it's part of building a network for you and your friends, so you all can take care of each other and feel both more financially secure and more emotionally secure, because when things go wrong and you need help, there's people there to help you, and there's also the mutual obligation that you're obligated to help them. So that's one of the, I think that's one of the things, because this D leadership class, it seems to be over, but it's not over. I keep noticing that you keep gathering them back together, even though it's been over for months. And to me, that's a sign that it lives on as an entity. Okay, so thanks so much. So that was wonderful, and
Thank you.
and we'll have more conversations in the future.
I want to take a moment to thank Bob, Perry, and Jeremy for a very enlightening discussion today. My name's Carissa Little, and I'm the Director of Programs at the Stanford Center for Professional Development. And we've been delivering education to industry for over 45 years, so we have reasonable experience creating education programs to address the career-long learning needs for professionals, managers, and executives in industry. As a part of the School of Engineering here at Stanford University, the Center for Professional Development has worked with faculty and departments to deliver degree programs online, as well as develop graduate certificates from most departments in the School of Engineering. We extend a range of fields from electrical engineering and computer science to management science and engineering, where the design leadership research you heard about today comes from. For graduate education, our center extends a non-degree option, which gives students the opportunity to take individual Stanford courses for credit. With this option, you can enroll and take a Stanford graduate course in the quarter it is offered. The graduate certificates allow you to explore new areas of interest and strengthen your current knowledge. We have over 23 graduate certificates in areas from energy technologies to international security and data mining. These certificates are comprised of 3 to 5 graduate courses and can be completed entirely online. In addition, our mission has really been to extend cutting-edge faculty research and content to industry, and so over the years we've developed a series of non-credit intensive short courses that range from an hour long to full professional certificate programs that require an application. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion with Professor Bob Sutton, Perry Claiborne, and Jeremy Utley. Bob's graduate course, Management Science and Engineering, number 280, Organizational Behavior and Evidence-Based Approach, is being offered online this fall. Bob has designed and teaches this course on our new blended learning platform to allow for more teamwork and improved collaboration between remote students. Bob is also the academic director of the Stanford Innovation and Entrepreneurship Professional Certificate. He also teaches a course as a part of that certificate titled Leading Innovation. And Perry and Jeremy have co-taught Empathize and Prototype, which is also a part of this professional certificate. These courses are now available to enroll online, and the graduate course, Management Science and Engineering 280, will open on August 1st for enrollment. To learn more about the topics in today's webinar, or to enroll, please visit scpd.stanford.edu, or either of the websites that you see under Graduate Course or Professional Education Course Enrollment. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact our customer service team at the email and phone numbers that you see on the screen. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and thank you so much for joining us.
Teaching folks leadership in a class called D Leadership, which is a class at the design school that's designed to actually send graduate students into organizations to lead design teams. And so a lot of our recent observations have come from watching folks in various cultural contexts with various industry and functional challenges try to advance ambiguous problem solving and creative problem solving inside of organizations. So much of what we're going to talk about today comes from that experience.
Great.
And the first thing that we wanted to show is a few cultural attributes that we believe are critical to fostering a new way of working. And so these are, as a leader, you've got to be focused on culture first and developing the kind of environment where people can thrive and do the kind of work that you want them to do. And so we wanted to acknowledge right away from the outset that depending on the culture, geographically or organizationally, you'll have to adapt your style in order to be effective. We've had experience in Latin America, in South America, in Asia, in Africa, and all of the things we talk about have to be amplified or diminished and tweaked to achieve the leader's desired ends. So we want to acknowledge right from the outset that you've got to be willing to adapt.
And you'll hear more about that. And so that's Jeremy. I could go on, but I don't want to take too much time. And then our buddy Perry Claiborne, who we've been working with for years, especially these guys work together a lot on leadership issues. And Perry, in addition to having taught various kinds of creativity classes at Stanford for over 15 years, Perry's been involved in various companies. He was the founding CEO of a company called Atlas, which designed and then helped spread the first modern snowshoe. Then he was a senior executive at Patagonia. And most recently, he was CEO of a messenger bag company called Timbuktu. So they're both guys who I would describe as are in between two parts of leadership. One, teaching it, two, studying it, and then also practicing it. So I think that's enough of an introduction. Why don't we did a little preparation for this. Maybe we should start out and talk about teaching leadership, since you guys are really into teaching leadership lately. Sure. And I think a lot of folks who are watching and listening to this will be interested in this. Why don't you kind of give us your perspective on teaching leadership?
Sure.
Great.
Well, thanks for having us, Bob.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
Always a delight.
So much of what we want to talk about today comes from some of our experience, specifically teaching and flex your style a little bit.
Can you give us a quick example of when you've had to adjust your style in response to the culture?
I feel like you're setting me up here. So we had an experience actually together, working in the Asian context. One thing that we identified quickly: a lot of the work that we do requires full participation and contribution from everybody in the room. And in some cultures, like the culture that we were working in, we noticed that there are hierarchy issues, and there's specifically folks feel a sense of deference to authority. That when there's a person with a higher rank or where there's someone's boss in the room, people shut down. And we acknowledged that early on as a real challenge to the work that we wanted to do, because we wanted every single person in this session to work and contribute their best ideas. And so we see leadership as a design challenge, actually. And so after the first day, the three of us got together and said, okay, what are we going to do to affect people's behavior such that we actually can achieve the outcomes we want to achieve? And we learned that as we reflected on these particular cultural challenges, we learned that people needed to
I'd like to welcome everybody to our discussion this morning. We're going to start out with a discussion of leadership with two of my close friends and master leaders and teachers of leaders. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll start talking. We'll spend about 20 or 25 minutes talking about leadership. And so let me start out with Mr. Utley, Mr. Jeremy Utley. So Jeremy has an interesting background. Even as a young man, he was in leadership positions, including he actually ran at Chick-fil-A early on in his life, which I think he laughs, but that's a good experience to actually have a bunch of people and have production goals and all that sort of stuff. Then he was a management consultant at a major consulting firm. I think we'll keep their name out of this for this purposes. But I think most critically for this, Jeremy, along with Perry Claiborne, we'll get to in a second, have been leading the efforts at the D School, which you learned about before. In particular, some of the stuff I'm interested in is they lead large groups and try to teach them how to become leaders when it comes to innovation.
Feel confident that they had time to articulate a statement that they actually believed in. And our style in this workshop was just throw people in and then say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And we realized in the Asian culture, that put people on the spot, and nobody likes being on the spot in front of their boss. And so what we did the second day is we said, all right, we need to change. And rather than asking people, what do you think? And you have to respond immediately in front of the camera, we said, okay, take 2 minutes, everybody write down a couple of things you think. And so we honored the fact that people needed to feel a little bit more equipped and prepared to answer a question. And then what we did to make sure that everybody had a voice and felt included, we actually went around and rather than asking people at random, we said, now we're all going to share the thing that we wrote down. And so we had every single person in the room share. And what that did over time is it gave the impression that everybody's ideas are valid, that no idea was necessarily bad, and that no one needed to be afraid of what someone else in the room thought. But it's subtle tweak to how we were managing the room.
I know we were going there, but that's an interesting example. The other part about that is we had a member of our team who was from Japan who helped a lot, Yusuke. And Yusuke said the goal was to make it so that it was embarrassing not to participate rather than to participate. And I thought